Good morning. Welcome. It's so amazing to see such a full room about cyber. We're so thrilled to have you here. My name is Sasha O'Connell. I lead the cybersecurity programming for Aspen Institute. It is my first time at Aspen Ideas, and it has been amazing and just incredible folks. Many of you in the room who I've met already this week, and really just an incredible opportunity to learn with all of you. And so an honor to be on this side of it for this session with such an amazing panel. Before we get started talking about cyber defense goes critical, I want to give my panelists a chance to introduce themselves. And I'm going to add an additional flair to this intro, if it's okay. Since I've been here this week and met so many folks and talked about what I have the privilege of doing here at Aspen, I've gotten the question, what is cyber and what does it mean at Aspen? And it's a great question. We were talking about it this morning. It's a perfect question. And before we jump in, we thought we'd start there. So I'm going to start with Anne and maybe ask you for a brief introduction. Many of you know Anne, of course. Everyone on the panel needs really no introduction. But Anne, if you could briefly introduce yourself and then maybe help us, how do you see what cyber is as a great place to start? And then we'll get into the rest of the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sasha. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anne Newberger. I served as Deputy National Security Advisor in the last administration, and I'm currently a lecturer at Stanford. And in terms of the definition of cyber, so I think about when we wake up in the morning, so many of our lives have gone online. We read the news online. We may connect into work or a call online. And indeed, when we turn on the water in our faucet, chances are the local water system is actually determining what chemicals go in the water to purify it, whether after a rainstorm or if there's been a breakout of a cold. That algorithm determining how much chemicals goes into the water is probably also determined by a digital system. All of those digital systems that are part of our lives can be attacked remotely, because in cyberspace there's no traditional borders as we have here, where there's gates and fences. So as such, there's criminals, there's countries who may seek to either disable or change the functioning of those systems. So cyber defense is the work to ensure that those who may try to spy on or disable those systems can't.
Awesome, thanks. Go ahead.
No, really glad to be here. So not only is this my first time to the Ideas Festival, it's actually my first time in Colorado. So I guess I shouldn't admit that to many people from here, but really second-guessing my decision to live in D.C. and New Jersey.
Exactly.
But that aside, so my name is Brandon Pugh. I am the Principal Cyber Advisor to the Secretary of the Army. So what does that mean? I was fortunate to be appointed by President Trump 2 weeks ago, only 2 weeks into the job. And my job is fairly new. The first Principal Cyber Advisor came on board in 2020, and we have 7 responsibilities in statute. At a high level, that's everything from how we train our cyber forces, how we're sending them up to Cyber Command, how we're acquiring cyber capabilities, how are we creating a culture of cyber warfighting within the Army. And I also have the unique ability to certify our cyber budget. So it is a vast portfolio, but have an incredible team. Prior to that, I served in 3 elected offices, so I have a unique view when it comes to critical infrastructure, being in the front lines as a local leader, and sometimes not having the resources to invest in cyber. But specific to your question, what is cyber? It's funny because I ask myself that on a daily basis, because even looking at the Pentagon, and this is a good thing, there's a lot of roles that have equities when it comes to cyber. On one hand, you could consider IT cyber, which is like a chief information officer activity. What I see it is, how are we protecting our systems from adversaries? Then also, how do we see cyber as a capability? Could cyber be used offensively? And I know that's something that this administration in particular has talked a lot more about. There's a lot of questions around that. Super exciting space, and happy to get into that today.
Thank you. Alyssa.
So I'm Alyssa Starzak. I'm Vice President and Deputy Chief Legal Officer at Cloudflare, which is a cybersecurity company, and I am also going to talk about what that is. But I'm so excited to be here today, and every time I come to Aspen, I think to myself, why am I in DC? So
we question our choices.
Brandon is not the only person to think that. So what is cyber to us from an industry standpoint? So it's also a business, right? We actually defend a lot of businesses, and that is really the core of what our mission is from an industry standpoint. And I think that gets to the question of why do you need it, right? Every business has things that are exposed online. So you could have data that could be exposed. You could have a ransomware attack potentially where somebody locks up your data so you can't access it, so you can't run your own systems. Or you could have something that's disruptive, meaning that you actually can't do business on a day-to-day. So at Cloudflare, typically we have a couple of different things that we do. We actually run a global network that has more than 20% of global websites that sit behind it and help protect them from cyber attack. So we can talk a little bit about all of those pieces, but you know, the reality is critical infrastructure can be a lot of different things in that world, and cyber can disrupt them all.
Thank you.
And real quick, if I selfishly might add, former General Counsel of the Army, so
yes.
the Army is well represented on this panel. This was not coordinated, though.
Go Army, beat Navy.
Exactly, thank you.
Perfect, very good. Such an esteemed group, and we're going to get into it, right? So in the context of our critical infrastructure, so our water, our power grid, these things we count on every day, we know today there's digital or cyber risks. So we're going to talk a little bit in the time we have today about what the current risks are, what the threat is, what the concerns are, why it matters to our daily lives. And again, that's why it's so great to see a full room, because it does matter to our daily lives. And then importantly here, we're going to talk about what we can do about it and what all different kind of aspects and leaders and components of our collective communities can do about it. Before we get to that, and Anne, I am going to throw it back to you to kick us off on the risks and current threats. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to answer the question myself about what cyber is. I grew up on the law enforcement side of things. I spent about 15 years at FBI. So cyber for me was very specific. It was about computer intrusions. So folks entering on without authorization to either steal data, right, change data, or deny access to data. Since leaving government service and having an opportunity to be in the private sector, university, and now at Aspen, I've seen it's actually broader than that. And so today I really think about it as our collective capability to buy down digital risk, right? Which is around us in so many ways. And again, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more here, specifically as it relates to those critical infrastructure functions that are so important to all of our lives. So with that in, what's the worry? Are we worried? Are we worried? Are we worried? What's to worry? Can you talk a little bit about the current landscape in cyber, specifically as it relates to critical infrastructure, and maybe even help us again frame what critical infrastructure is would be a great place to start.
Absolutely. So as our lives moved online, as we think about cyber threats, generally in any military warfare case, and I spent 20 years in the intelligence community and did joint operations with Cyber Command as well, it's far easier to attack than to defend in every situation, right? So an attacker needs to find one way in, one door, one window that's ajar. A defender has to be monitoring all of them. And when we think about the cyber defense of a system, you're thinking about each user who has access to a network. You're thinking about the devices on a network. For example, if you walk into a hospital, an MRI system, the system that the nurses use to monitor all the rooms so that they can determine if somebody needs help, all of those systems are connected. And as a result, each of those become a potential point of entry for an attacker. So in terms of the threats, we think about threats in really two buckets. One is data, and one is the actual operations of those systems. I'll give two examples. You know, people may have seen, just about 6 months ago, there was a lot of press about the Chinese compromise of many of America's large and medium telecoms. Telecoms are the crown jewel of espionage because whether it's a high-ranking politician's phone conversation that's riding on a telecom network, whether it's companies' most important R&D that's being emailed within a network, right? There's a lot of data on a telecom network. So it made sense that China sought to hack in to America's telecoms. They were successful at scale. In some cases, it took years till the telecoms found them. And the reason is because these are large networks. There's a lot of old systems on them. Companies don't necessarily recognize that they're up against a sophisticated country with a sophisticated cyber program, and they don't necessarily make the investments. They always say, it's not going to be me. And in the United States, because we're a nation that respects civil liberties and privacy, the US government doesn't defend critical power, telecom, or pipeline networks because they're owned by the private sector. And there's, under the Fourth Amendment, it's been ruled that that would be monitoring of private sector communication. So as a result, in the US government system, we leave the defense of critical infrastructure to the private sector. I personally think that it's time for us to reconsider that. That's a separate conversation we can have. But as a result, when China wanted to get this mother lode of data, they hacked into multiple telecoms, and many of the telecoms, even the nation's largest, were not making the investments, were not equipped to defend against them. When we talk about the threat of actual disruption of operations, I think about one of the worst days of my life when I was serving in the White House, which was when the Secretary of HHS called. And generally, he didn't call for good news. And my team walked in and said, "Anne, Secretary of HHS is on the phone." I picked it up. He said, "Anne, we have a cyber attack against a hospital chain. This chain owns hundreds of hospitals across the country, and it was a ransomware attack. A ransomware attack are attacks done generally by criminals based in Russia. The Russian government gives them safe haven, and they do it for the money. Essentially, they hack systems, they lock the system so they don't operate, and they tell the company, pay us a ransom." That's what happened here. And essentially, the hospital's operations ceased. So think about somebody walking into the emergency room, and the hospital normally can pull up your medical records. They couldn't, so they didn't know what you were allergic to, what drugs you were on, what were your prior cases. A nurse who's monitoring a floor, the reason there's a small number of nurses is because they're monitoring every room. Those systems locked. So essentially, you had hospitals across the country that couldn't operate. And we can talk about the things the US government has tried to do, including offensive cyber attacks back against these entities, and the limits of what we've been able to accomplish with a combination of diplomacy, building international partnerships, frankly, offensive cyber attacks back against these entities. But that gives you so to sum up, when we think about the current threat today, think about it in two bins: criminals and countries, and disruption of systems and espionage. The same set of activities to improve cyber defenses defend against all of those.
Thank you. Brandon, do you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah, I think Anne makes a number of good points, and maybe I'll elaborate on three of them. I think it's important to keep in mind there's really no specific entity that a bad actor is after. Anything is fair game. When I was serving in state elected office, one of my school districts was unfortunately home to one of the earliest ransomware incidents. And it was surprising because they were a very small school district, roughly 100 students. So you're like, well, you wouldn't think somebody like that would be vulnerable to a cyber incident. And I think that's a good memory because you might be running a large organization or a small one, you're a potential target. In fact, sometimes the smallest are actually seen as a more advantageous target because theoretically they wouldn't have as many resources to put into their cyber defense. And that's really across our different types of critical infrastructure. So whether that's government setting, water, energy, obviously there's an adversary is more active than others, but I think the takeaway is there's a risk in most of them. Second is why they're doing it. And I think this is a scary thing to Anne's point. Sometimes we don't readily see it. Not to say any type of incident is better than another, but if you have a ransomware incident, largely you're going to see that fairly early on. There's going to be a request for money or something in return. The more concerning aspect for me sometimes is when we don't know. And we saw that with Volt Typhoon and even Salt Typhoon for a large period of time, where we had an adversary that had infiltrated our systems for a large period of time, and we were not aware of that. And why are they doing that? Sometimes it is for intel gathering purposes. Other times it's pre-positioning for a future conflict. So perhaps we have a military conflict, and the adversary has an advantage of burrowing into our systems now. And that from an Army perspective, that's something we're very concerned about. We actually have had a program in the Army called Jack Voltaic for a number of years. And I won't bore you by the history, but essentially we work with 2 major cities per year just to identify, to Anne's point, a lot of this infrastructure is private. And a lot of times the militaries are relying on that. So if there is a disruption to civilian infrastructure, how is that going to impact the military's ability now to mobilize tanks, individuals? And the takeaway was there was a potential risk there, and too often times municipalities and large cities are focusing on other types of threats, and I get it, that's important too, hurricanes, chemical weapon threats. What they have found time after time again was cyber was usually a more distant threat and something that was not practiced, but there can be a large implication on the military side. I mean, the Army has roughly 500 military bases, and you can imagine across the country there's wide variations in terms of our preparedness, and I think that's something from a military perspective that we need to continue to focus on.
Thanks. Alyssa, I want to give you a chance, both what you see, such an interesting perspective, obviously at Cloudflare in terms of the threat itself, and then we've already started talking about, too, why we should care, right? So we've heard about hospitals, we've heard about telecom, we've heard about military bases being dependent on these infrastructures. So I want to give you a chance to, what are we missing on understanding the threat picture? And what else? Also, Brandon mentioned we all need to care because it's not necessarily targeted to us, and we might get caught up in it. Can you add on both of those?
Yeah, I actually want to start to answer that. I think I want to start with a little bit of a story with Russia and Ukraine, because it's kind of an interesting description of that maybe makes some of the things that Brandon was talking about real. So when, just before Russia invaded Ukraine, they actually did a bunch of cyber attacks, and they were not sophisticated cyber attacks. Russia can be a sophisticated cyber actor, but a lot of the things they did were just intended to scare people. So what do? You shut down people's ATMs. You shut down people's access to information about transportation out, and you combine that with a bombing operation, essentially. So what are you trying to do? You're trying to terrify a population with things that they normally have access to and all of a sudden don't anymore. And so when you combine it and you think about what Brandon just said, so he referenced two different campaigns, Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon. Volt Typhoon he suggested is prepositioning. What that was China essentially sitting in our critical infrastructure and saying, if we need to, we can turn it off, right? So in that same vein, it's this concept that imagine a day where something goes wrong, geopolitics, where you're not paying attention to the world, you're going about your day-to-day life, but something is happening in the world, and the US and China go into a conflict, and all of a sudden, your gas stations don't work. Your hospitals are attacked. You can't bank, right? So the world of things that could affect you on a personal level, I think, become very real with cyber. And I think that's one of the things that's distinguishing and why we worry about it so much. I also think, going back to that question about what is critical infrastructure, I think to Anne's point, a lot of what we see are small targets, right? So your local water system, if you don't live in a big town, may be small. You have a lot of different disparate entities where we don't always aggregate resources, and we don't always think about, hey, what do they need, right? So the idea that a small school district, which, why would anybody attack a school district, right? Well, maybe it's a source for money. That's the ransomware idea, because nobody wants information locked up. There are all sorts of possibilities, and from a cyber practitioner standpoint, you can kind of go down endless avenues of possibilities of the things that could go wrong. So.
Perfect, thank you. Before we move on, and we will have time, about 10 minutes at the end for questions, so please keep them in mind. And we do want to turn pretty soon to what we can do about this and what's been tried and ahead. But before we do, Anne, you've had such an interesting opportunity at the White House to talk to folks about why this matters. And can you just sort of, what else are we missing, sort of this pitch around why it matters? Because we do see, as to us, so critical these issues are. Sometimes they're not top of mind for policymakers or even business leaders. Can you talk a little bit about your experience around communicating on this issue?
It's such a great question, because what we would often see is we do briefings to companies to explain the risk. We'll do briefings at National Governor Association to explain the risk and the steps that folks can take. But sometimes people will say, oh, it seems impossible, so why start? So I think a big part of the communication is to say, cyber defense really does make a difference. So I served at the National Security Agency, and at the time, I led our intelligence unit. In other words, I led NSA's hackers. And before I moved over to running NSA's cyber defense mission, I sat down with a group of hackers and said, tell me what makes life hard. And they gave me a list of the things that made their life hard when US adversaries were practicing those cybersecurity practices. And those are the things we took back and said, let's implement ourselves. So in other words, in the back and forth in digital space, much as in the back and forth in a conventional military area, right? Our adversaries have missiles, we build missile defense. And that back and forth applies in cyberspace as well. And even beyond the malicious side of criminal or not criminal, I was recalling that last year during the Aspen event, we had the CrowdStrike incident. In that case, there was no malicious intent. CrowdStrike did not adequately test an update to their systems, and when they pushed out that update, in some sets of customers, it failed. And it caused significant impact. On a personal note, we had a new grandbaby born, and I couldn't get home because there were no flights out of Denver, Colorado. So I remember this incident very, very well.
Very personal.
It's very personal.
I was also stuck in Denver, so I can appreciate that. And I remember Anne on stage when all of this was happening. So
yes, you're right, because I was up all night, because I was still at the White House managing. It was quite funny. The Situation Room was very sweet. They're like, Anne, we realize you're 2 hours behind us, So we thought, you might not wake up till 6, so we thought we would call you at 4, to make sure you got to work. I said, thank you. That was actually very thoughtful. I appreciate it. But in any event, the reason I note this is to say our economy, our national security, our personal lives now ride on this digital layer. The security of that digital layer is in all of our hands, whether as a private individual, whether as a CEO, or whether as somebody in local, state, or national government. So it really takes that joint partnership, and that's why it's great, by the way, to have Alyssa here. And I'm going to just give a quick shout out because Brandon mentioned the first cyber attack of a school. So Alyssa's smiling because she knows what I'm going to reference. There was a significant rise in ransomware attacks against the nation's schools. And it was done in a really malicious way, targeting databases regarding students, kids who'd gone in for psychological counseling, kids who were struggling. And these particular hackers were threatening, and they did, release these records online. So really embarrassing to kids, really, really not really a mean thing to do. And at that point, I was serving in the White House, and we knew that getting a government program out to do cyber defense of the nation's schools would take a long time talking to Congress, getting funding, et cetera. So I reached out to a number of companies and said, you guys, that you all, you have a nonprofit arm, think you can help. Cloudflare raised their hand first and deployed a free program for the nation's schools, small schools with less than 2,500 kids, which generally are the ones that have the fewest resources, and essentially offering free cybersecurity. And I think at the end we had like 9,000 schools across the country. So a shout out to exactly that kind of partnership that really made a difference.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you, Anne, for the pivot to what we can do. So maybe turning back to you, Alyssa, as well. We know this takes public-private partnerships. We hear about this. We know this is about building resilience as well as response capabilities. I want to give each of you a chance to talk about opportunities and initiatives you've worked on that you see working. We're going to do this in 2 parts. One, without talking about AI, and then we're going to go back down and talk about how AI intersects both with the threat landscape and with response capabilities. So first, Alyssa, perfect tee up for you. Can you talk about kind of what's working and what you see working ahead and where we need to head on this?
Yeah, Anne's description, which I very much appreciate, was that it was a really interesting experience for us because we actually, from a company standpoint, we offer a lot of different free programs. We actually have a view that basically tools should be available to a lot of people. So we protect small businesses, we protect nonprofits, and mostly for free. And so the school district one, it actually, from an ask standpoint, was very much something that we do in general. We benefit from seeing a lot of threat data. That's good for our very high-end customers, I'll be honest, but it's also good for the small ones. And so there's a benefit to it for us when we offer programs like that. But the interesting thing about that program was it took a couple of different pieces collaborating, which is that, school districts, even if we say, hey, we have a free program, they're going to be like, yeah, okay, everybody's got something. You've got something to sell me, right? And the reality of collaboration with government saying, hey, these are the kinds of tools you need to adopt. Not saying that you need to adopt these particular ones, but this is something really important to do. And there are free tools if you want them out there. Is one of the reasons we had such adoption in that program. So it's not one-sided, right? Industry has an incredible role to play. We actually have tool sets that are available and should be broadly available to the to critical infrastructure. But government plays a role in building trust and building understanding of what is required, and really having a collaboration. So, one of the realities of cyberspace or cybersecurity in general, what we often say from a cybersecurity company standpoint is that, we're all competitors in many ways, but we're also partners because we have to be. We all have shared adversaries. And so from a practical standpoint, we are looking for ways to collaborate across different companies and sectors from the public sector side and the private sector side so we can actually defend as many entities as possible.
Perfect. Brandon, I want to turn to you. I want to just put a point on something Alyssa said too. Something I think we're seeing from an Aspen cyber perspective as we talk to folks are the two components you're talking about, Alyssa, is those technical capabilities and the knowledge, but also the trust piece, right? And connecting all of those pieces, particularly with smaller potential rural entities, whether it's water or schools or otherwise. So I think that's a really important takeaway. Brandon, I know you've seen this problem from a number of perspectives over the years. You've been 2 weeks at Army. Can you break down everything that's happening
exactly.
at Army and let us know what works?
Yeah, no, one quick thing I can't resist on the school side, because I mean, schools took up 8 or 9 years of my life just doing cyber there. It was as an elected official, so adjacent, I should say. But it's interesting. You may be sitting here saying, well, we know of the issue. Why are schools not doing more? Put yourself in a school district perspective. Most school districts have 80% of their budgets fixed, and the other 20% is going to buying textbooks, school buses, and everything else. So you're lucky if you can hire a director of technology who's buying laptops and implementing them. You're very lucky now if you take that added step to find somebody that either has a cybersecurity skill set or independent. So sometimes it's not a matter of like wanting to, it just comes down to sometimes resources and making those tough calls. But in terms of what is the Army doing, it's actually a really interesting time to be at the Pentagon for a number of reasons. You know, I'd say the Army in itself is undergoing a large transformation now, and that's something that's exciting for me. Secretary Hegseth in April tasked my boss, Secretary Driscoll, to really take a hard look at the Army and see how we need to modernize it for the future battlefield. You know, in light of a growing threat from China, looking at what type of technology we actually need and how do we do that. So what I shouldn't say we, I've 2 weeks in now, Secretary Driscoll has done for much longer, has been what he's coined the Army Transformation Initiative. And essentially, it's doing a lot of things. It's essentially looking at our processes, how we're structured. But what's really interesting for my portfolio is one of the 5 priorities Secretary Hegseth tasked them with looking at is one of the 5 is cyber. The other ones are tech. So it's really taking an interesting look at saying, how are we evolving? And to see cyber as one of the top 5 priorities is super interesting. And you may be saying, well, how are we going to find this investment? I think it's a matter of taking a hard look at what we've been doing for a long time. So, you know, ceasing outdated systems. And that's something we've really been taking a hard look at. And to give you some numbers to back that up, it's projected we'll save about $48 billion over the next 5 years. And with flat budgets, that's important because now that allows us to reinvest that into other areas. The other areas being AI, autonomy, counter UAS, drones, cyber. So being able to really predict where the future of conflict is going to be. And that's something that the ATI under my boss's leadership is really looking to do. And I would say, maybe I'm slightly biased being there now, you know, getting government to move is sometimes take a long process. We have seen, exactly, no surprise to anybody here with all of your federal backgrounds. I have personally not witnessed such large progress in a short period of time. And this is designed to be an iterative process. This isn't something saying ATI is going to be done under a year, realizing that this threat landscape is going to continue to evolve, so we may need to continue to take a look at the Army. So that's the grand vision of where the Army is going. What are some specific steps? Ann had mentioned the distinct role between civilian and military in terms of our critical infrastructure. A unique asset we have in this country are National Guards. There is phenomenal National Guard capability and cyber-specific units. Actually, the number of states that have a cyber capacity in their Guard is increasing. And a lot of times, these individuals are working in cyber capacities in their local community. So it makes sense. They know their community. They know the threats that are specific to their community. And now they're able to go help, you know, in conjunction with the civilian authorities, combat some of these threats. We've seen awesome case studies with that. One, you know, that is a real concern is Guam. Happy to kind of go to that in Q&A, but that's a great example of where our National Guard was mobilized because of the increased threat we witnessed last year with some of these pre-positioning, you know, capabilities.
Thanks. And speaking of getting the government to do things that work, would love your perspective, obviously, on so many things that you got incredible collaborations and stakeholders together to do. Also, because I'm feeling like there's too much agreement on this panel. If we could also, maybe if you could offer some thoughts on the roles of companies here, right? Is this a space for regulation? Do we need to be secure by design? Where are we there? We've talked a lot about government's responsibility and private sector and response, but if you can add a piece on that, and then I promise I'll give everyone a chance to respond, that would be great.
Perfect. So, yes, so I'll talk about one shift the last administration did, which was a dramatic departure from both prior Democratic and Republican initiatives. And that was for the first time to put in place minimum requirements for critical pipelines, water, railroads, and airports across the country. And because Congress, the last time Congress had tried to pass legislation setting those minimum cyber requirements on these private sector systems, it was 2015 and it failed miserably. And since then, because there was this debate about is it too much regulation to require private companies operating critical infrastructure to do the minimums we've been talking about for a long time, nothing had happened on the Hill. So the way we did that in the prior White House was to say there are traditional safety regulations in all these areas. So for example, when you think about a railroad, when they used to be mechanical, there were safety rules. Now they're digital. So we issued what's called interpretive rules, rules that essentially said the safety applied in analog systems, in old systems, mechanical systems, they apply in digital systems. And we used that for the first time to levy regulations. It had a dramatic impact in at least getting companies to do the minimums, putting in place multi-factor instead of just a password that's compromised, monitoring systems for threats, which many were not monitoring already. It was controversial enough that 6 state AGs, attorney generals, sued to roll back the water regulations. They said we should not be regulating cybersecurity of water systems. It was particularly ironic that they did so because in the ensuing months, 3 countries attacked America's water systems: Iran, Russia, and China, in various states. And because it was important to all of us to keep cybersecurity as bipartisan as possible, we didn't make a point of like putting it that neatly together. But as a result, so that was a significant shift. For now, the Trump administration has maintained those regulations. Again, it's just for critical infrastructure, but that was one significant shift to say the private sector isn't taking steps on its own. The risks of a cyber attack against a railroad when the signaling systems are controlled digitally is significant. The risks of attacks on water systems, Iran has cyber attacked Israel's water systems. It's not classified, but it's not publicly known. Ironically enough, Israel has an old world defense in that they have fish in an interim system, and the fish started to die, which let them know there was some issue, and they were, because the chlorine had been adjusted in those systems. So as a result, you know, there's a real threat there. The second key effort, which this one I think is one where there is a difference of view, I think, right now between administrations, is an effort called the Cyber Trust Mark. I don't know how many folks here have heard of Energy Star. So Energy Star is like a mark, a star, on devices to show whether they're energy efficient. And we copied that, copying a program that's in place in Singapore, actually, for cyber. It's a voluntary program, but companies producing internet-connected devices, baby monitors, personal fitness devices, home security systems, if they submit their products to be tested against the government cybersecurity standard and they pass, they bear a government label. So a consumer, whether shopping online or in a store, Best Buy, can look for the label and know that this is a cyber-secure device. So that program was rolled out, and companies, LG, Samsung, Google, Amazon, given how much online shopping that is matter, all agreed to participate. Companies started submitting products. And I think for right now, the Trump administration is still deciding whether to continue that program. But that's a second example of, again, the first one is a regulation, the second is voluntary. But efforts to try to move the ball forward because of a recognition that there's so many vulnerable devices and our lives rely on them more and more.
Thank you. Both
Yeah,
wanted to take
you
a
just want to
shot?
go
Yep.
first? Or?
Sure.
Sure.
So one other initiative that Anne didn't talk about. So there's a lot of interest in the regulatory side and what actually makes people more secure. And I think one thing that often comes up on regulation from an industry standpoint is that often you see regulation, and we deal with this a lot in Europe, where it essentially becomes a little bit of a checkbox exercise, where it doesn't actually make you more secure, but it's a have you done X? Yes, I have. Have you checked Y? Yes, I have. And you go down the exercise, and it's actually not necessarily improving the security of the underlying system, but requires a lot of checks. So there's a balance where how do you figure out the right level of regulatory intervention that actually encourages the right kind of behavior, and how do you make sure you're not doing something that just adds requirements that don't help, right? And so from a practical standpoint, I think we always end up with a little bit with that balance. I think one of the initiatives that happened in the last administration that I actually thought was a really interesting one was there are often areas where you can push industry, even without regulatory intervention, to improve security. And so we saw something called the Secure by Design initiative, which was really thinking about some of the larger companies and saying to them, hey, if you actually design something that starts secure, all of the people who use it are going to be better off. So don't create a set of defaults where people have to add on security. Start with security by default. And it's been a really, so by default and by design are the two components of it. And I thought it was a really interesting initiative because it's pushing people to really think about security in the first instance, which then has a flow-down effect for everybody who uses those services. So from a practical standpoint, I think there's an interesting play between those two for industry. Industry generally wants to do the right thing by its customers. It doesn't want customers to get breached. It doesn't want systems to get breached. But it doesn't always know what is going to be accessible. And so just kind of pushing them a little bit to think about it and make sure it happens is an interesting piece. I think people fight when they think it's going to be incredibly burdensome and overregulated. But they're willing to go along if they see it as being in the best interest of their customers and their and everyone who uses the system.
I want to leave a little bit of time about AI implications before we get to questions. But Brandon, I will give you the last word on this. I know this could be its own panel. Is the voluntary enough? Where do you see regulation? The problem is persisting. Does the government need to lean in more?
Sure. Yeah, well, as in a good attorney, let me give you a disclaimer. This is what I'm about to say is not part of my Army portfolio. When I was at a think tank immediately preceding this, cyber regulation and then equally as important, the harmonization and deregulation, as appropriate, that was something near and dear to me. And if you're sitting here saying, well, who in the new administration could potentially handle this? Likely it'd be the National Cyber Director's Office at the White House, and we do have a nominee there pending. Then we also have a nominee at CISA, or cybersecurity agency in the country. But in terms of like my personal thoughts, I think where we need to lean into is really taking a stake of what regulation do we have in the books now and seeing where is there duplication and how can we harmonize that. I know that's an easier statement to say. There's a lot of work that goes into that in terms of like what is an appropriate baseline look like. There is a difference between there being minimum practices but making them so stringent that very few companies would have the resources for. So getting into that granularity I think is important. I can say sometimes on the industry side it can be challenging because there are scenarios where one company might have multiple regulators. And sometimes, this isn't always, there is overlap. Sometimes they contradict one another. And that's not ideal either because to your point, then it can become more of a regulatory regime and more of a compliance exercise and something you're taking your security engineers off. And I won't say who. There's a very prominent company in this country who has reported publicly they've taken off their security defenders in an effort to just comply with regulation. That can't be the outcome we want. So where do we fall in this continuum? That's not, fortunately, that's something I'm near and dear to me. That's not part of my portfolio in the Army, but I do think it's important for the new administration to be considering that.
Thanks, Brandon. Okay, we got like 3-4 minutes, and we're going to solve the integration of AI and cyber. So I'll start with you, Alyssa. We'll go down the line and let Anne, you have the final word. I know you all are thinking a lot about this. I know this is its own panel, but can you just give us some headlines around the integration of AI, both on the threat stream you're seeing and the capacity to keep up and defend successfully?
Yeah, it's incredibly important on both sides. The thing that AI has done is made it really easy to attack. It's easy to find it's easier to find vulnerabilities. It's easy to generate things at scale. It's easy to do things to sort of scan for a lot of things. There used to be sort of a security by obscurity, right, where people they had their stuff open, but nobody could ever find it. They weren't looking for it. It was fine. Nobody, there's a lot of stuff out there, and you couldn't find it. With AI, that's not the case anymore. It's really easy to go through troves and troves of information and data to find vulnerabilities. I think, and then also generate attacks, right? So anybody can generate an attack. It's unfortunately not very hard. You can buy them online. It's AI generated attacks. It's not that hard. I think on the flip side, it's kind of terrifying actually. On the flip side of that, though, the reality is that AI and machine learning in particular have been around in the cyber world for a long time. I mentioned that we have a network at scale. We protect We protect, again, something like 20% of global websites, millions and millions of websites around the world. That's a tremendous amount of threat information. The only way we can process it is to use AI to identify new things, right? So what we try to do using AI and machine learning is find common attacks, deploy things in real time where you can actually block it at scale, and then move forward across everybody who uses our infrastructure. So if you think about that from a movement forward, the ability to do that in real time is an incredible benefit from a defender standpoint, because you can protect everybody from an attack that is seen in one small part of the world that may not have generated much attention. And in fact, we've had actually machine learning. We've had AI detect attacks that no human would have otherwise noticed, and had immediately deploy remediate that attack.
Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, just being mindful of time.
Sorry.
No,
Oh,
you're fine.
no.
No,
No,
but
you're good.
during Q&A, happy to expand upon what I'm about to say. I'm naturally an optimist when it comes to technology and AI in particular. That's not saying there's not any degree of risk, but we can work through that. I think AI for cyber right now is at a stance where the defender still is an advantage. And I think we need to lean into that innovation, be looking for unique use cases, not only for defense, but perhaps offense as well, leveraging AI. And to your point, like, we have been using it in the security space for a long time, but the rise of generative AI, at least in my perspective, has led to new innovations at a much quicker speed. I mean, what I'm talking about is either the ability to autonomously respond to incidents leveraging AI, which for an organization doesn't have a large tech budget or the capacity. Those types of cases are very positive. On our side, U.S. Cyber Command is really leading the charge. Congress directed Cyber Command to have an AI task force, which they've been looking at unique use cases. In particular, given the size of the federal government, how do we identify vulnerabilities across the federal government at scale, leveraging AI? And I'd say tremendous work has been done, but this space for anybody that follows AI is changing so quickly. It just constantly requires the federal government to stay on top of this and stay ahead of the adversary. And I think that's the biggest risk here is we can't fool ourselves. Our adversaries and enemies are going to be looking to this as well. So how do we have an environment in the U.S. that keeps us ahead of them? And that's what I'm concerned with.
Anne?
So I very much agree with both what Alyssa and Brandon said. In cyberspace, it's far easier to attack than defend. So I think the delta, the difference that AI will make for defenders is significant. A lot of the work of cyber defense can be manual, can be repetitive. You're looking through firewall logs to see, is there evidence that something looks anomalous, something looks suspicious? AI can help do that, can help summarize all different kinds of logs to make cyber defense work, frankly, faster. And the key thing often in cybersecurity is it's really hard to keep an attacker out, but you want to find them fast before they move across the network, find what they're interested in, or encrypt the network, for example. And I think AI will be a game changer. And I love Brandon's point that in the federal government runs a massive network, and there aren't legal issues with actually training models on that data to try to find anomalous practices, to try to push defenses out quickly. So I think there's really a massive opportunity now for the federal government to kind of essentially train models on itself and then offer that as a service to state and local governments. Because what's the most interesting thing about cybersecurity is the same attack is used again and again, right? People are often using the same devices, they're the same vulnerabilities. So it's really the speed of how quickly you find it and push out a defense that can be economically scaled easily. And I think there's really an opportunity now.
Awesome, thank you. With that, we have time for a couple questions. I see you ready to go right there. Yes.
Oh my.
Just if you don't mind waiting for the mic so we can get you on the recording as well.
Sure, so under the theory that the best defense is a strong offense, we hear a lot about the vulnerabilities that we have for satellite and water and power systems. Do our adversaries know that we can give as good or better than we get? And do you think within the next 1 to 2 years, our defensive capabilities will improve such that those systems I mentioned will be secure?
Can I ask you to introduce yourself and
Yeah, sure. I'm Steve Fishman from Los Angeles.
Yeah. Want me to take that
Sure.
since I ran national policy on
please.
offensive and defenve cyber? And it might be a little easier to not be a serving government official.
I love having them both here. So.
Life is so much easier once you're no longer in government, Brandon.
It's funny because coming from a think tank, you're paid to give an opinion. It's so unique. Whereas now you're like, wait, is that official yet? Is it yes? Like, sorry.
So cyberspace is one continuum on offense and defense, right? If we conduct an offensive cyber attack, we should expect that the target country will respond. And we are so nationally vulnerable for all the reasons we just discussed that we live in a glass house. So the biggest constraint on our own offensive cyber operations is our own vulnerabilities. And that's why I'm a big believer, because I believe we should be doing more on offense, tackling defense so that we feel that we can handle any retaliation and manage that. I truly believe improving our defense enables us to better use offensive capabilities.
Anybody else? Sure, go ahead. We're just going to wait on the mic 1 second. And again, sorry, if you don't mind introducing yourself and your affiliation, if you're comfortable.
Hello, yes, Manny Garcia, software engineer. DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, your thoughts on them? We've seen we've seen largely unvetted broad data access, privacy violations, individuals hired with limited to no government experience, attempted aggregations of sensitive data such as SSN, IRS, voting records, immigration, which in the age of I is extremely concerning to hear. I believe the Trump administration has even increased the funding for this government entity. And I just wanted to know your thoughts on these security practices, since you mentioned best defense, and what is the predicted direction of security protections for U.S. citizen data?
And I would ask Brandon if you're comfortable answering on
No,
behalf
I mean,
of the Army, not the whole U.S. government.
It may not be a totally satisfying answer. I mean, the high level, like my portfolio doesn't interface with Doge. Like, so your knowledge on Doge is publicly what mine is. I mean, like the DoD is like I shouldn't say distinct. Like, there's obviously some overlap. They have their own priorities versus where mine is. Mine is squarely in the cyber portfolio of the Army, from our networks to how we leverage Army. So, and that's not a totally satisfying answer. I will say the theme, apart from Doge, is similar to the Army of like, look, we have limited resources, and like, how do we better utilize them at times? So it may mean shifting priorities. It may mean difficult calls in terms of structure. I mean, the Army has seen that. We've had a number of structural changes. Moving more of our senior leaders from the Pentagon and bringing them out to our formations, realizing that perhaps we don't need the number of general officers sitting at the Pentagon. They could be better served in our formations. Perhaps we don't need as many standalone commands because they are resource intensive. Maybe we can merge commands, and those are things we've done. Perhaps we're buying technology and equipment that we don't need. Maybe it's not suitable for the current battlefield, and we can reinvest those. So, like, I know those are themes that we're seeing in the Army, not connected with Doge. But I will say, like, there is an appetite to maybe be more efficient, make sure we're prepared, posturing. I come in from a very defense and national security landscape, so it's only one view. But
all right, next. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Laura Entwistle. I'm with Unheard, a social impact media company in Singapore. Just a question. We've been talking a lot about institutions and corporations being hit with cybercrime. Individually, we're all getting hit daily with a very fast-growing form of cybercrime called scamming. Now, trillion-dollar business, $1 billion annually. What can corporations and the government be doing to protect us individually?
I'm going to turn it over to the panel, but I can't help but make a quick plug for a project we're co-leading out of Aspen Digital called Take 9. So if you're not familiar, the website is PAWSE, P-A-U-S-E. We would like it to be P-A-W-S and get some dogs involved. That's a whole other marketing.
Dogs floating around, I've seen.
I know, it's a whole other marketing campaign. So this is a large-scale public service awareness campaign that's being funded by Craig Newmark Philanthropies. It kicked off about 8 months ago, and it is really directed at consumer and consumer education. It turns out, and I'll turn it over to this panel for additional thoughts, but the advice is pretty consistent on what individuals need to do, and what's tricky is getting them to do it. So we're trying a campaign that's not fear-based, for lack of a better word, but using humor, social media, and other ways. If there are folks in the room who are employers, there are corporate opportunities to partner. All of the collateral, creative and otherwise, is open source because of the funding through Craig Newmark Philanthropies. So businesses can use them for their employees, for their customers. We have visions of in schools and otherwise. So that's one resource. But let me turn it over to this panel, who probably has others as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very real question for individuals. I mean, my parents who are elderly, sort of inclined to click on the link, right? It sounds too good to be true. It generally is. I think the hard part about some of those pieces is that education is phenomenal, But the reality is, from a company standpoint, if you had something similar, if parallel to phishing, which is the emails that come into you and say, they're spear phishing, trying to get access to your system, we actually have technical mechanisms to prevent, even if you click on the link, it from going through. Right? So there is a sort of technical cybersecurity world on the back end of it for businesses that are focused on phishing, because they don't want it to go through. I think on an individual level, we don't have that as much, and that is a sort of long-term challenge. And I think that those are actually, there's some technical challenges that we could potentially address. I think from a company standpoint, from a large platform standpoint, or a large provider standpoint, there's also an opportunity for AI to help detect and mitigate things in real time, right? So imagine things are coming in as SMS messages, right? Text messages on your phone. Your provider is looking at all of that data in real time and trying to find ones that are problematic so it can block it for other people. So there is a reality of, if you get a message like that, report it. It will be better. It's a better long-term data set. It is something that can actually get used later on to help other people. It may be obvious to you that you shouldn't click on it, but don't just leave it and not click on it. If you can report it as junk, it will actually go to systems that could potentially help.
And we just have a few seconds left. I do want to offer you both also an opportunity to speak to this issue, because I do think the consumer-focused piece is extremely important. So Brandon, then Anne, last words on
No,
it?
fully agree on the AI nexus. I will say something new is, the Department of Defense CIO put out guidance a few days ago, basically saying the defense industrial base is an increased risk of cyber activity. And they gave steps to take. And for any cybersecurity practitioner in the room, they may seem common sense. They're very straightforward. The sad thing is so many times the basics of security, especially at the consumer level, are ignored, and sometimes even in the corporate world. And that's very unfortunate. I mean, to give you one that you've all have heard, but still is not being done commonly, is just even something as basic as multi-factor authentication. So many times people are not doing that. And look, is that a foolproof to keeping you cyber secure? No, nothing's foolproof, but it is an important step that you can take to decrease your risk. And all of those steps, they were directed at these defense industrial-based companies to get them to do the basics, to really drive down their threat. And I think it's important.
Appreciate it. I know we're at time, but Anne, final word on this sort of consumer-focused, what individuals can do piece, and we'll wrap.
First, I agree with Alyssa that the Aspen effort is important, so people are educated and know what to be aware of. But a second really hopeful effort I want to lift up is the Digital Mobile License Program by Apple and Google with state governments. So essentially what that is our licenses, right? The states we live in already have some basic information about us, where we live, our heights, our weights, our social security numbers. And now when you go to renew your license, they can create a digital ID, essentially saved on your phone, in your secure sandbox on your phone, that is a federally recognized digital ID. The reason that matters is because America has 9 times the rate of identity fraud of any of our peer countries. Why is that? Because wherever you go, if somebody asks you for your federal ID, what do you give? Your license, your social security number. Social security databases have been compromised many, many times. So these programs, which now there'll be a digital ID on your phone, and the US government is now creating the standards, you can use that to access your bank records, your hospital records, easily through your phone, will actually, I believe, move Americans in an easy way, right? Because if security is not easy, nobody's going to use it, from passwords, which are not equipped to handle the kind of attacks, or social security numbers, which those databases have been compromised so many times. So read about it. Red and blue states across the country are already doing digital mobile license programs so that on your phone you can save a digital ID that you can use when you're, for example, logging in to databases of sensitive information, medical, financial, that are important to you, to keep that kind of data safe. And when you get links to that point, pause, wait, check the email address, because sometimes the name will be somebody you know and love, or a friend or a colleague. The email address will show you it's not really them. Those kind of steps will save a lot of trouble.
Thank you for the question, and hopefully inspiring to end on some things we all can do. So please join me in thanking our amazing panel.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, guys.
Great job.